Subaru CVTs, we've talked about this topic many times in the past over many different videos, but I think it's time we compile all of that information into one concise, updated video talking about the operation of, common failures of, and service intervals of. So with that said, let's go ahead and jump into this definitive Subaru CVT video. So guys, before we get too deep into the video, let's start with some basics, some knowledge for some of you that don't know basically anything about a CVT other than it's in your Subaru and people talk bad about it. So first off, CVT is an acronym standing for Continuously Variable Transmission. So if you make the mistake of saying CVT transmission like I know I do, you're actually being redundant because the T in CVT stands for transmission, so you're actually saying Continuously Variable Transmission. So, CVTs and what they mean for you and your Subaru. So, a CVT is like any other transmission. Its job is to take power from the engine and put it to the wheels to propel the car down the road by varying or changing gear ratios to accelerate the car. Now, the way a CVT works in the bare bones, stripped downest explanation possible is there's essentially 5 pieces that are at work here. You have an input shaft that supplies power from the engine into the transmission. You have an output shaft that supplies power from the transmission out to the wheels. Now, hooked to those shafts, you have variators. There's one on the input shaft and one on the output shaft. Now, a variator is a spool or a pulley that can change its outer diameter, its overall size, and it can become smaller or it can become larger within a preset size of largest and smallest. And it can vary that size. That's where the variable part of the continuously variable transmission comes from. Now, between those two variators is either a chain or a belt. In the case of Subaru, it is a metal chain. So that means that engine power comes into the transmission via the input shaft, which turns that variator that is chained to the other variator that turns the output shaft to supply the forward motion to the wheels. That is your bare bones explanation of a CVT. It's 2 pulleys that can change their overall size to vary the gear ratios with a chain in between to take power from the engine and put it out to the wheels to turn the wheels and move you down the road. Now, with a conventional transmission or a conventional automatic transmission and a manual transmission, you have preset gear ratios that are a certain number of revolutions in for a certain number of revolutions out, and that is their set parameter. But with the CVT, they can continuously vary their gear ratios by changing the size of the input and output variators. That is your main difference. So you've got input into a chain, output. That's a CVT. It's very rudimentary when you break it all down. It doesn't have a ton of moving parts, say, compared to a traditional automatic transmission, which means it can be made smaller and more compact than a traditional conventional automatic transmission. Now that we all have a baseline understanding of what a CVT is and how it fundamentally works, why did Subaru get rid of their conventional automatic transmissions and most of their manual transmissions in favor of a CVT starting in model year 2010? Well, that comes down to fuel economy and emissions, the EPA CAFE standards. The CVT was the only transmission that Subaru could quickly, cheaply manufacture, develop as a small brand as they are, put into their vehicles with the same overall footprint, basically, and improve their fuel economy and lessen their emissions. Now, looking at it on paper, the CVT looks like a phenomenal choice for a transmission. It gives you good power delivery by keeping the engine in its optimal power band. It gives you good fuel economy by keeping the RPMs low when cruising. It also is very simplistic as far as moving parts and the large components, and it doesn't take up a ton of room and can be made lighter than a conventional automatic or a manual transmission. So what's the downside here? Why does Subaru and CVT have a bad reputation, or it appears to have a bad reputation based on what we see posted on the internet, both here YouTube, internet forums, etc.? Well, like anything else mechanical, it has its issues. Nothing mechanical is perfect. Nothing mechanical will last forever. Everything has a flaw, has an issue, has a weakness, has a failure point, and the Subaru CVT is not exempt from that. neither is any other transmission on the market from any other manufacturer. Everybody has their issues. They're not always the same, they're not always shared, and they don't always come at the same time or mileage, but they have them nonetheless. And I think people lose sight of that more times than not, that think that just because the Subaru CVT has X amount of issues and they're 1, 2, 3, 4, that it's a bad transmission, when they don't look at other transmissions and their issues and their cost to repair and compare and contrast them. So as far as Subaru CVTs are concerned, there's really only two models, the TR690 and the TR580. Now there's lots of different variations of the TR690 and TR580, but as far as Subaru CVTs go, there are only two at the end of the day. Now, as far as common issues are concerned, these span different model years that had different issues than, say, others, but primarily we're going to cover what is the most common for these failure points. So failure point number one is torque converters. Now, there is a torque converter clutch failure that was really present on the first CVTs, the TR690, introduced in 2010, 2011. On the legacy Outbacks, they were notorious for their torque converter clutch failures. Now, what happened there was a mechanical failure where the clutch would not disengage when coming to a stop, stalling out your engine. Similar to if you had a manual transmission car, came to a stop without pushing in the clutch and without pulling the car out of gear. Same deal, you'd stall your engine. Well, that's what happened with the torque converter clutch failures on these early TR690s. There was an issue mechanically inside that kept that clutch engaged where it would not release even when the solenoid released pressure, and it would stall your engine out the same as that manual not pushing the clutch pedal in. Similar thing. The only repair for it was to replace the torque converter with an updated torque converter. Subaru went for a redesign and fixed the issue. Surprisingly, here in 2024, there are still 2010s and 2011s that are affected by this that have not been replaced yet, so they don't always fail at the same time or the same mileage. We've seen failures over the last 14 years out of these transmissions. Now, it is an expensive repair. The part itself is about $800 to $850 last time I priced a torque converter, and the price to replace it depends on which way your technician goes, whether they pull your engine out to replace the torque converter or they drop your transmission. You can go either way. A lot of times if you need other engine work done, they'll pull the engine and do the torque converter that way. I prefer to pull the engine myself because I can pull an engine out in 35 minutes and transmission takes me over an hour. So whatever's the fastest is the way I'm going at it. Now, as far as modern CVTs, if you go by 2024, the torque converter clutch issue hasn't been an issue for a very long time. It was really just the 2010, 2011 TR690s, the first iteration of the CVT, that had these issues. After the redesign, there hasn't been a consistent failure upon one of the transmission models or a set particular model year range. Now, there are random failures of these torque converters here and there, but there's no like die-hard, like the 2010, 2011's known issue with torque converters. So if you go buy a new Subaru or buy one that's not a 2010 or 2011, you really don't have to worry about your torque converter failing or the torque converter clutch failing. It's not a common concern, except on those first two model years. So moving on from the torque converter clutch failures, the second failure that is common on Subarus, and probably the biggest failure I see on Subaru CVTs, are valve bodies. Now, not just the valve body, not technically a valve body failure, but the solenoids that are attached to the valve body. Unfortunately, you cannot buy these solenoids separate from the valve body, so you have to buy that valve body as an assembly with the solenoids on it. Now, these solenoids are just small little solenoids that control the flow of hydraulic fluid or transmission fluid or the CVT fluid through the valve body and direct it to different places within the transmission. All they are, as most solenoids are, is a coil of wire that opens and closes a plunger or mechanism, and those with lots of time and lots of age and lots of wear can burn out. They can burn out, open up the windings of the coil, and the solenoid just becomes no good. Now, 9 times out of 10, when one of the solenoids fails on these cars, it is the torque converter clutch lockup solenoid, just because it is probably the most active one, always locking and unlocking the torque converter clutch. Now, when this happens, again, you can't just go buy about a $100 solenoid from Subaru for whatever reason. You have to buy between a $750 and $850 valve body assembly, depending on if you have a TR580 or TR690. Now, if you have the TR580, it is a little bit cheaper in labor to get this replaced because the valve body sits on top of the transmission. It's easier to access, and it is a top plate with a gasket and a fluid change, whereas if you have a TR690, the pan underneath has to be dropped and the valve body has to be dropped out from underneath the transmission, so it's more labor intensive and it takes longer to reseal that pan, have that set up before you put the fluid back in it. At the end of the day, you still have to do a CVT learn process with a scan tool, and it's a pretty involved repair. But thankfully, this failure is not super common. It doesn't happen all the time. Normally, it happens between 150,000 miles and 200,000 miles. That seems to be the range that these solenoids finally give up the ghost. And so it's not something that you're having to do every 50,000 miles or every 100,000 miles. It's a 150 to 200,000 mile range. It happens most of the time. So at least you're not doing this repair a lot. It's a 1 or 2 time repair in the lifetime of the vehicle, depending on how much you drive and how long you keep the car for. Now, a lot of people would prefer to go buy a solenoid only, and you can find aftermarket solenoids that are cheap Chinese solenoids more than not. And every time I've seen someone or had someone comment here saying that they were going to change the solenoid only, they come back later, either a month later or a year later, saying they had to do the job all over again and replace that solenoid once again because the cheap solenoid did fail. So you have to ask yourself, is it worth doing it right the first time, an expense the first time, or doing it wrong the first time, going cheap, and then having to do it a second time, because the CVT fluid is not cheap. It is expensive. It's about $20 a quart. You're going to go through a couple $100s worth of fluid. You got all that time invested in dropping the valve body and replacing that solenoid and installing it back in there. You have to redo the gasket on the TR690. You have to put a new gasket on the TR580. There's a lot of time, a lot of labor and expense with just changing the solenoid to have it fail again. So one of the good things about getting the valve body assembly with all the solenoids on it is if they all made it to 150 to 200,000 miles before they failed, when you put that new assembly in there, you get another 150 to 200,000 miles before they fail again. So in theory, you could go to 350, 400,000 miles before you need to worry about a valve body failure or a solenoid failure again on your Subaru CVT. So it's not that big of a nightmare. It is something that you are going to have to deal with if you have a higher mileage Subaru, or if you plan on buying a Subaru and running it over 250,000 miles. You are going to experience this failure at some point or another, but again, fix it once and you really don't have to worry about it again in the ownership of that vehicle, unless you just put tons and tons of miles on a car in a very short amount of time. So on to failure number 3, which is a lot less common, and I haven't really experienced it once firsthand, and that is chain slip. Now, chain slip is exactly what it sounds like. The metal chain actually starts to slip and slide over the variators, and once that starts, it's really hard to get it not to do it without having to replace that transmission. Now, once that metal chain starts to slip on those metal variators, it's going to dig, it's going to cause actual physical damage, and it's going to create a slick spot. And once that chain rides in that slick spot again, it's going to become more and more easy for it to slip in the future. And again, it's just going to start wearing and tearing up the chain, tearing up the variators, and it's a slippery slope, so to say. Once it starts, it's kind of going to keep going until failure. Now, again, this is a very uncommon issue. I don't see a ton of chain slip. I've never personally seen chain slip firsthand. I have seen videos online of other people with Subarus and having chain slip in their vehicle. The main symptom you'll have is driving down the road, normally at a consistent speed, highway speed, 55, 60 mile an hour. And every once in a while, you'll see your RPM shoot up and you'll hear a loud squealing noise. And that is the chain slipping as the engine revs up, because that chain slipped and allowed it to free spin without the pull of the car and the driveline on it. So chain slippage and chain breakage do happen, but they are an extremely rare issue. There was a while back where Ascents were breaking their chains in their CVT, but Subaru extended the warranty. They were under warranty. They fixed that issue. They replaced the transmissions. One thing I can say about Subaru is they have been great about the CVT and extending the warranty to 10 years, 100,000 miles on the majority of the vehicles they offer with a CVT. So they do stand behind the product, they do back it, and they do have a great CVT. Honestly, of all the CVTs on the market, whether it be Nissan, Subaru, etc., Subaru, I think, has the best CVT on the market today. Look at Nissan. Nissan brought CVTs out way earlier than Subaru did, and they still can't figure it out. They still can't get them to stop failing. I mean, they even fell right off the showroom floor. It's inconsistency in their manufacturing or something. I don't know what it is, but Nissan has a horrible time with CVTs. Subaru has gotten a bad rap for their CVT, but in all honesty, if you look at the entire amount of CVTs they have made and the amount of failures percentage-wise, Subaru makes a great transmission with that lineartronic CVT. Now, a fourth and very small issue is main bearings. Now, there's bearings inside the transmission case that these shafts and variators ride on, and in the very first Subaru CVTs, there were issues where those bearings would get noisy and start to tear up and would require a transmission replacement or rebuild. But again, that was a very small percentage as well on those failures. So a lot of it is that, when people have bad experiences and bad reviews, bad news travels further and faster than good news. There's not a lot of people getting online and saying, hey, I've got a Subaru CVT with 200,000 miles on it. It's never given me a lick of issue. But as soon as someone goes and buys a Subaru and they have an issue where their chain slips or chain breaks, they have a torque converter go out or whatever, they're going to go online and say, this piece of junk cost me a ton of money, Subarus are horrible, the CVT failed on me, etc. So you got to take that into mind when you look at this stuff, this information that's out there. A lot of people blow it out of proportion, and always bad news, bad information, bad reviews travels further and faster than good. So I think, as well as a lot of other people think, that the main root cause of all the CVT failures Subaru experiences, especially in the USA, is due to lack of maintenance. Now, if you look at Subaru or Subaru of America's recommendations, theirs has always been that the CVT fluid is a lifetime fluid. It never needs to be changed. It never needs to be serviced and should not be touched. And that is just flat out wrong, bad information. We've done videos in the past talking about this. We've done videos not so far in the past on this and how things have changed as information has gotten out. Now, the big issue, again, with the solenoids, with the torque converter clutch, with the chain slip, I think is suspended contaminants in the fluid and the dirtying of the fluid causing wear, premature wear on these components, causing these failure points. Now, again, Subaru America says lifetime fluid, don't service it. Now, what that means is we're trying to show a lower cost of ownership by lessening the maintenance requirements on these vehicles. That fluid is not cheap, as I said in the past. To do a regular drain and refill service of the CVT fluid, you're looking at $200+ in fluid alone. It is not a cheap fluid. And to service that, and service that regularly, that is an added expense for a Subaru owner that Subaru America did not want to show consumers. So to show a lower cost of ownership, they said, well, it's a lifetime fluid. Now, if you treat it as a lifetime fluid, it will absolutely be a lifetime fluid. That fluid will work for the lifetime of the transmission until it fails, until the chain starts slipping, the chain breaks, or something else catastrophic happens inside. That's the thing about a lifetime fluid. As long as you don't touch it, it will last the lifetime of that transmission whenever it so decides to fail. And when it fails, it was good for the lifetime of that transmission. Whether it be 80,000 miles or 200,000 miles, whatever that lifespan was, it was good for it, as you saw. Now, when we go and look at Subaru Japan, the mothership, their recommendations have not changed. Subaru always said they wanted 3-year, 36,000 mile drain and refills on transmission fluid on the manual transmissions, on the conventional automatics that came before the CVT. They have stayed the course with the CVT. They want to see 3-year, 36,000 mile drain and refills on the fluid as well. Keep that fluid fresh, keep it getting circulated out for the bad for new, and keep it at a good state of less contamination. So, again, I think the majority of these issues, a lot of these failures, and a lot of the issues from the Subaru CVT results directly from Subaru of America's saying it's a lifetime fluid and not to service it. If you service it, it will last longer, and I think a lot of these issues will be alleviated on your vehicle. So at the end of the day, you've got to look at it this way. Do you want to spend $250 to $300 for services every 3 years, 36,000 miles on your CVT, or do you want to replace the entire CVT for about $8,500 at 100,000 miles? Now, it's always cheaper to maintain than repair or replace. So for my money and my Subarus, I will continue to service my CVT fluid and go against the recommendations of Subaru of America. Now, I currently own several Subarus with CVTs that have high mileage on them. I've got 230,000 miles on my 2011 Outback with its original installed TR690. Now, yes, I did have to replace the torque converter because it failed at about 185,000 miles. And yes, I did have to replace the valve body because it failed at about 190,000 miles. But here we are at 230,000 miles, the factory installed transmission, and it's still going well, going strong. The Crosstrek hybrid I got, it has a CVT. It's a little bit different than a traditional TR580 due to the hybrid components in it, but it's right at 200,000 miles on its factory CVT. My mother's 2014 Forester, it has 230,000 miles on its original TR580. And my 2013 Crosstrek I recently sold before buying the Crosstrek hybrid had 235,000 miles on its factory installed TR580 as well. It did have a valve body replacement done at 171,000 miles, but that was the only issue it really had. So in all honesty, looking at longevity wise, looking at mileage driven and years owned, Subaru CVTs can be very, very reliable as long as you are driving them responsibly, not, accelerating and full throttling them all the time and being abusive to them. You want to service them and extend the life of them. And, if you have an issue from new to 100,000 miles or a 10-year period, Subaru will cover it and make it right for you. So I don't understand all of the resistance people have now that's been 14 years with the Subaru CVT. There's all this pushback about, oh, well, it doesn't drive well, and oh, it doesn't give you a lot of power. What are you expecting from a four-cylinder all-wheel drive vehicle with less than 200 horsepower in the naturally aspirated models? I mean, these are not race cars. They are a means of transportation. They get the job done, and they get you down the road, and they give you better fuel economy for having all-wheel drive capabilities. It's just upsides. Yes, they drive funny. Yes, they don't shift gears, although after people complained, 2015 and newer started doing fake gear shifts, which actually took away from the efficiency of the CVT and the reason why a CVT is the way it is. But we can get in that later. So guys, that brings us to the end of the video. We've talked about what the Subaru CVT is, how it works, and what it means for you and your Subaru. We've talked about the 4 main issues and failure points that they experience in commonality, and why you should start servicing your Subaru CVT and ignore Subaru of America's recommendations if you want longevity and reliability from your Subaru CVT. Guys, let me know your thoughts and feelings down below in the comment section. Do you like CVTs? Have you warmed up to the idea over the last 14 years? Or do you flat out still hate them? And what you think Subaru should do instead of a CVT? And please don't come at me with the 8 and 10 speed conventional transmissions. It just doesn't, it's not feasible. Subaru doesn't have the money to engineer, develop, and the weight and size to put that into play with their all-wheel drive system. The CVT was the best option for them at the time and still is today. So what would change your mind from being a hater of Subaru CVTs? Thank you guys so much for watching. Be sure to like, comment, subscribe for future Subaru content, and I will see you guys in the next video.